The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, Chapter 2. On board the Dawn Treader. Ah, there you are, Lucy, said Caspian. We were just waiting for you. This is my captain, the Lord Drinian. The dark-haired man went down on one knee and kissed her hand. The only others present were Reepicheep and Edmund. Where is Eustace? Asked Lucy. In bed, said Edmund, and I don't think we can do anything for him. It only makes him worse if you try to be nice to him. Meanwhile, said Caspian, we want to talk. By Jove, we do, said Edmund, and first, about time. It's a year ago by our time since we left you before your coronation. How long has it been in Narnia? Exactly 3 years, said Caspian. All going well, asked Edmund. You don't suppose I'd have left my kingdom and put to sea unless all was well, answered the king. It couldn't be better. There's no trouble at all between the Telmarines, the dwarves, the talking beasts, the fauns, and the rest. We gave those troublesome giants on the frontier a good beating last summer, and they pay tribute now. And I had an excellent person to leave regent while I'm away. Trumpkin the dwarf, you remember him? Dear Trumpkin, said Lucy, of course I do. You couldn't have made a better choice. Loyal as a badger, ma'am, and valiant as a mouse, said Drinian. He was going to say as a lion, but he noticed Reepicheep's eyes fixed on him. And where are we heading for? Asked Edmund. Well, said Caspian, that's a rather long story. Perhaps you remember that when I was a child, my usurping Uncle Miraz had gotten rid of the 7 friends of my father, who might have taken my part, by sending them off to explore the unknown eastern seas beyond the lone islands. Yes, said Lucy, and none of them ever came back. Right. Well, on my coronation day, with Aslan's approval, I swore an oath that once I'd established peace in Narnia, that I will sail east myself for a year and a day to find my father's friends, or learn of their deaths and to avenge them if I could. Their names were Lord Revilian, Lord Byrne, Lord Argaz, Lord Mavramorn, the Lord Octesian, the Lord Restamar. Oh, and the other one's so hard to remember. The Lord Roop, sire, said Drinian. Roop, of course. That was my main intention, but Reepicheep here has an even higher hope. Everyone's eyes turned to the mouse. As high as my spirit, it said, though perhaps as small as my stature. Why else would we not come to the very eastern end of the world? And what might we find there? I expect to find Aslan's own country. It is always from the east, across the sea, that the great lion comes to us. I say, that is an idea, said Edmund in an odd voice. But do you think Aslan's country would be the sort of country, that you could ever sail to? I do not know, madam, said Reepicheep, but there it is. When I was in my cradle, a woodwoman, a dryad, spoke a verse over me. Where the sky and water meet, where the waves grow sweet, doubt not, Reepicheep, to find all you seek there in the utter east. I do not know what it means, but the spell of it has been on me my whole life. And after a short silence, Lucy asked, and where are we now, Caspian? The captain can tell you better than I, said Caspian, so Drinian got out his chart and spread it on the table. That is our position, he said, laying his finger on it, or was as of noon today. We've had a fair wind from Cair Paravel and stood a little north for Galima, where we made it the next day. We're in port for a week, for the Duke of Galima made a great tournament for His Majesty, and there he unhorsed many knights, and got a few nasty falls myself, Drinian. Some bruises are still there, put in Caspian. And unhorsed many knights, repeated Drinian with a grin. We thought the Duke would be pleased if the King's Majesty would have married his daughter, but nothing came of that. Squints. And has freckles, said Caspian. Poor girl, said Lucy. And we sailed from Galama and ran into the cabin for the best part of 2 days and had a row But then the wind again, and did not make Terabithia until the 4th day from Ukalama. There their king sent out warning not to land, for there was sickness in Terabithia. But we doubled up the cape and put her on a little creek far from the city and watered. There we had to lie off for 3 days before we got a southeast wind and stood out for the 7 isles. The 3rd day's out, a pirate, Terabithians by her rig, overhauled us. But when she saw us well armed, she stood off, and after some shooting of arrows on either part. And we ought to have given her chase and boarded her and hanged every mother's son of them, said Reapy Cheap. And in 5 days more, we were in sight of Mule, which, as you know, is the westernmost of the 7 isles. So let's go back and see if we can figure out on this map what happened. Okay. So they started off here at Cair Paravel. They went all the way up to Galm, and then down here to Terabithia. And then they went all the way up here to Mule, which is the westernmost of the 7 islands. Let's see, did they go past that? Then we rode through the straits and came about sundown to Redhaven on the Isle of Bren, where we were lovingly feasted and had victuals and water at will. We left Redhaven 6 days and have made marvelously good speed, so I hope to see the Lone Islands the day after tomorrow. The sum is we are nearly 30 days in sea and have sailed more than 400 leagues from Narnia. So then, from these islands, they sailed down, and this is about where they joined the ship, because they're on their way over here to the Lone Islands. See? And after the Lone Islands, asked Lucy. No one knows, Your Majesty, answered Drinian, unless the Low Islanders themselves can tell us. They couldn't in our day, said Edmund. Then, said Reapy Shape, it is after the Lone Islands that the adventure really begins. Caspian now suggested that they might like to be shown over the ship before supper. But Lucy's conscience smote her, and she said, I really think someone must go and see Eustace. Seasickness is horrid, you know. If I had my own cordial with me, I could cure him. But you had, said Caspian. I'd quite forgotten about it. As you left it, I thought it might be regarded as one of the royal treasures, so I brought it. And if you think it ought to be wasted on a thing like seasickness, it'll only take a drop, said Lucy. Caspian opened one of the lockers beneath the bench and brought forth the beautiful little diamond flask that Lucy remembered so well. Take back your own, Queen, he said. And then they left the cabin and went out into the sunshine. In the deck, there were two long hatches, fore and aft of the mast, and they were both open, as they always were in fair weather, to let in light and air into the belly of the ship. Caspian led them down the late ladder after the hatch, and here they found themselves in a place where benches for rowing ran from side to side, and the light came in through the oar holes and danced across the roof. Of course, Caspian's ship was not that horrible thing, a galley rowed by slaves. Oars were used only when the wind failed or for getting in and out of harbor, and everyone, except for Reapy Cheap, whose legs were too short, had often taken a turn. At each side of the ship, the space under the benches was left clear for the rowers' feet. But all down the center there was a kind of pit, which went down to the very keel, and this was filled with all kinds of things. Sacks of flour, casks of water and beer, barrels of pork and jars of honey, skin bottles of wine, apples, nuts, cheeses, biscuits, turnips, sides of bacon. From the roof, that is, the underside of the deck, hung hams and strings, onions, and also the men of the watch off duty in their hammocks. Caspian led them aft, stepping from bench to bench. At least it was stepping for him. It was something between a step and a jump for Lucy, and a real long jump for Reapy Cheap. In this way, they came to the partition with a door in it. Caspian opened the door and led them to the cabin, filled the stern underneath the into the cabin, which filled the stern underneath the deck's cabin in the poop. It was, of course, not so nice. It It was very low, and the sides sloped together as they went down. There was hardly any floor. Though it had a window of thick glass, they were not made to open because they were under the water. In fact, at this very moment, as the ship pitched, they were alternately golden with sunlight and dim green with the sea. "You and I must lodge here, Edmund," said the Caspian. "We'll leave your kinsmen in the bunk and sling hammocks for ourselves." "I beseech you, your majesty," said Drinian. "No, shipmate," said Caspian. "We've argued that out already. You and Rince was the mate, are sailing the ship, and we'll have the cares and labors of many a night when we are singing catches or telling stories. So you and he must have the port cabin above. King Edmund and I can lie very snug here below. But how is the stranger?" There's another picture of them exploring the underside of the ship. And here's what the ship looks like, of course, from up top. Eustace was very green in his face and scowled, and when asked if there was any sign of a storm getting any less. Caspian said, "What storm?" And Drinian burst out laughing. "Storm, young master," he roared. "This is as fair a weather as a man could ask for." "Who's that?" said Eustace irritably. "Send him away. His voice goes through my head." "I've brought you something that will make you feel better, Eustace," said Lucy. "Oh, go away and leave me alone," growled Eustace. But he took a drop from her flask, though he thought it was beastly stuff. The smell in the cabin, as she opened it, was delicious. It is certain that his face came to be the right color a few moments after he swallowed it, and he must have felt better, because instead of wailing about the storm in his head, he began demanding to be put ashore at the first port, and he would lodge a disposition against them all with the British Council. But when Reepicheep asked what a disposition was and how you lodged it, Reepicheep thought it was some new way of arranging in single combat. Eustace could only reply, "Fancy, not knowing it. In the end, they succeeded in convincing Eustace that they were already sailing as fast as they could towards the nearest land that they knew, and there was no more power of sending him back to Cambridge, which is where Uncle Harold lived, than sending him to the moon. After that, he sulkily agreed to put on fresh clothes, which had been put out for him, and come on deck. Caspian now showed them over the ship, and indeed they had seen most of it already. They went up to the forecastle and saw the lookout man standing on a little shelf inside the gilded dragon's neck, peering through its open mouth. Inside the forecastle was a galley, or ship's kitchen, and the quarters for such people as the boatswain, the carpenter, the cook, the master archer. If you think it odd to have a galley in the bow, so imagine the smoke from the chimney streaming back over the ship. And that is because you're thinking of steamships, where there's always a headwind. But on sailing ships, the wind is coming from behind. So anything smelly you want to put as far forward as possible. They were taken up to the fighting top, and at first it was rather alarming to rock to and fro and see the deck looking very small and very far away beneath you. Then you realize that if you fell, there's no particular reason why you should fall on board rather than in the sea. Then they were taken to the poop, where Rince was on duty with the other man at the great tiller, and behind the dragon's tail rose up, covered in gilding, the round inside ran a little bench. The name of the ship was the Dawn Treader, and she was only a little bit of a thing compared to one of our ships, or even the cogs and dromons and carracks and galleons which Narnia had owned under King Edmund and Lucy, and had reigned there with Peter as the High King, for all navigation had died out in the reigns of Caspian's ancestors. When his uncle Miraz the usurper had sent the 7 lords to sea, they had to buy a galleon ship and man it with hired galleon sailors. But now Caspian had begun to teach Narnians to be seafaring folks once more, and the Dawn Treader was the finest ship he had built yet. She was so small that forward of the mast there was hardly any deck room between the central hatch and the ship's boat on the other side of the hen coop. Lucy fed the hens on the other. But she was a beauty of her kind. A lady, as the sailors say. Her lines were perfect. her colors pure, and every spar and rope and pin lovingly made. Eustace, of course, could be pleased with nothing and kept on boasting about the liners and motorboats and aeroplanes and submarines, and if he knew anything about them, muttered Edmund. But the other two were delighted with the Dawn Treader. When they returned aft to the cabin and supper, they saw the whole western sky lit with an immense crimson sunset, and felt the quiver of the ship, and tasted the salt on their lips, and thought of unlands on the eastern rim of the world. Lucy felt as if she was almost too happy to speak. What Eustace thought had best be told in his own words, for when they all got their clothes back, dried the next morning, he at once got a little black notebook and a pencil and started to keep a diary. He always had this notebook on him and kept record of his marks on it, for though he didn't care much about any subject, for his own sake, he cared a great deal about marks and would even go to people and say, "I got so much, what did you get?" But he didn't seem likely to get many marks on the Dawn Treader, and he now started a diary, and this was his first entry. August 7th. Have now been 24 hours on this ghastly boat, if it hasn't been a dream. All the time a frightful storm has been raging. It's a good thing that I'm not seasick. Huge waves keep coming over the front, and I have seen the boat go nearly under a number of times. All the others pretend to take no notice of this, either from swank or because Harold says that one of the most cowardly things ordinary do is shut their eyes to the facts. It's madness to come out of the sea in a rotten little thing like this, not much bigger than a lifeboat, and, of course, absolutely primitive indoors. No proper saloon, no radio, no bathrooms, no deck chairs. I was dragged all over it yesterday evening, and it would make anyone sick to hear Caspian showing off his funny little toy boat as if it was the Queen Mary. I tried to tell him what real ships were like, but he's too dense. E and L, of course, didn't back me up. I suppose a kid like L doesn't realize the danger, and E is buttering up to C as he does to everyone here. They call him King. I said I was a Republican, but then he asked me what that meant. He doesn't seem to know anything at all. Needless to say, I have been put in the worst cabin of the boat, a perfect dungeon, and Lucy has been given a whole room on the deck to herself, almost a nice room compared to the rest of the place. C says it's because she's a girl. I tried to make him see what Alberta says, and that all sort of thing is really lowering girls, but he's too dense. Still, he might see that I shall be ill if I'm kept in that hole any longer. E says we mustn't grumble because C is sharing it with us to make room for L, as if that didn't make it even more crowded and far worse. Nearly forgot to say, there's also this kind of mouse thing that gives everyone the most frightful cheek. The others just put up with it as if they like it, but I shall twist its tail pretty soon if he tries it with me. The food is frightful too. The trouble between Eustace and Reepicheep arrived even sooner than one might have expected. Before dinner the next day, when the others were sitting round the table waiting, being at sea gives one a magnificent appetite, Eustace came rushing in, wringing his hands and shouting out, "That little brute half killed me, and I insist on it being kept under control. I will bring action against you, Caspian. I order you to have it destroyed." At the same moment, Reepicheep appeared. His sword was drawn and his whiskers looked very fierce, but he was polite as ever. "I ask your pardons all," he said, "and especially Her Majesty's. If I had known that he would take refuge here, I would have awaited a more reasonable time for his correction." "What on earth's up?" said Edmund. What had really happened was this. Reepicheep, who never felt the ship was getting fast enough, loved to sit on the bulwarks far ahead, just behind the dragon's head, gazing out the eastern sea horizon and singing softly in his little chirping song, the song the Dryad had made for him. So this is Reepicheep riding just behind the dragon's head. Just enjoying the sea, singing a song. He had never held on to anything, however the ship pitched, and kept his balance with perfect ease. Perhaps his long tail hanging down to the deck inside the bulwarks made that easier. Everyone on board was familiar with this habit, and the sailors liked it because when one was on lookout duty, it gave one somebody to talk to. Why exactly Eustace had slipped and reeled and stumbled all his way forward to the forecastle, he had not yet got his sea legs, I never heard. Perhaps he hoped he would see land, and perhaps he wanted to hang out in the galley and scrounge something. Anyway, as soon as he saw the rather long tail hanging down, and perhaps it was rather tempting, he thought it would be delightful to catch hold of it and swing Reepicheep round by it once or twice upside down, then run away and laugh. At first, the plan seemed to work beautifully. The mouse was not much heavier than a very large cat, and Eustace had him off the rail, and in a thrice, and very silly he looked, thought Eustace, with all his little limbs splayed about and his mouth open. But unfortunately, Reepicheep, who had fought for his life many a time, never lost his head, not even for a moment, nor his skill. It was not very easy to draw one's sword when one is swinging round by one's tail, but he did. And the next thing Eustace knew was 2 agonizing jabs in his hand, which made him let go of the tail. And then the next thing after was the mouse had picked itself up again, and as if it were a ball bouncing off the deck. And there it was facing him, and the horrid, long, bright, sharp thing like a skewer was waving to and fro within an inch from his stomach. This doesn't count as below the belt for mice in Narnia, because they were hardly expected to reach higher. "Stop it," spluttered Eustace. "Go away. Put that thing away. That is not safe. Stop it, I say. I'll tell Caspian. I'll have you muzzled and tied up." Why do you not draw your own sword, poltroon?" cheeped the mouse. "Draw and fight. I'll beat you black and blue with the flat." "I haven't got one," said Eustace. "I'm a pacifist, and I don't believe in fighting." "Do I understand," said Reepicheep, withdrawing his sword for a moment and speaking very sternly, "that you do not intend to give me satisfaction?" "I don't know what you mean," said Eustace, nursing his hand. "But if you don't know how to take a joke, I shan't bother my head about you." "Then take that," said Reepicheep, "and that, to teach you manners and respect due to a knight and a mouse's tail." And with each word he gave Eustace a blow with the side of his rapier, which is a thin, fine, dwarf-tempered steel, and very supple and effective as a birch rod. Eustace, of course, was at a school where they didn't have corporal punishment, so the sensation was quite new to him, which is why, in spite of having no sea legs, it took him less than a minute to get off that forecastle, cover the whole length of the deck, and burst into the cabin door, still hotly pursued by Reepicheep. Indeed, it seemed to Eustace that the rapier, as well as the pursuit, was hot, and it might have been red hot by the feel. It was not much difficulty in setting the matter once Eustace realized that everyone took the idea of a duel very seriously, and heard Caspian offering to lend him a sword, and Drinny and Edmund discussing whether he ought to be handicapped in some way to make up for him being so much bigger than Reepicheep. He apologized sulkily and went off with Lucy to have his hand bathed and bandaged, and went to his bunk. He was careful to lie on his side. And that is the end of chapter 2.